Yes, I'm Barry Gills, Editor of Globalizations Journal and Professor of Development Studies at the University of Helsinki in Finland. It's now the 5th year of the global crisis, and I've seen that the crisis is not a singular one crisis, but several multiple overlapping simultaneous crises of different types, who are all mutually influencing each other in a sort of overall global crisis. So the way I've discussed that before is that there is obviously a capitalist crisis. It's a periodic crisis and the failure of the financial system, but also other aspects of a long-term structural change in marketization, privatization, deregulation, financialization. Structural changes that brought about a capitalist crisis with an epicenter in the old centers of the North in particular, and affecting them most severely. But it's also a systemic crisis in the sense that the world order is in a transition. It's in a hegemonic transition. The unipolar moment of the United States as hegemon is now unraveling, and very clearly there's a global center shift in motion. These can take many decades, are difficult to define in time, and are not inevitable or predetermined, but you can see that there's a major structural change going on in the economy with a shift towards higher growth rates, dynamism, the ascent of the global south, the former periphery of the world system, and the relative decline of the old centers, and they are in a period of long-term stagnation and internal conflict and crisis of many dimensions, and an inability to just immediately resolve these problems. They are very long-term problems in the old centers. So there's a very different crisis in the North, the global North, as to the crisis in the global South, but they are affecting one another. And the civilizational crisis, which is much more historically situated in a long-term framework, but is more comprehensive or profound, and it includes the time in world history which we're in, which might be quite unique, that we face such an immense range of challenges, not least of which is our dependency on fossil fuels, the climate change and global warming crisis, various types of environmental system crises, water, forests, soils, the oceans. And that makes this crisis very different historically. We're probably at a very pivotal moment in human history, which I think it's no exaggeration to say, that what happens and the changes that take place over the next 20 years will really very much determine the future nature of world civilization and world order. So this is not an ordinary crisis. It's much bigger than the collapse of some of the financial markets a few years ago, and it is still ongoing. So I've talked about 3 Ds: displacement, deferral, and deepening. That the displacements were from the financial sector to the real economy, from the private sector to the public sector, and from the private debt into sovereign debt, and back again into the problems of currency crises, and then the austerity measures followed in the mainstream. On the whole, you might characterize these as quite conservative policies of re-articulating the state in order to re-commodify society and deepen marketization, as opposed to reversing it. Marketization, by many people's estimation, was a significant part of the cause of this present economic and social crisis, but far from marketization receding, it's actually intensifying, with privatization very much part of the austerity policy measures. So there's a displacement in many ways where society then bears most of the costs of the adjustments to the crisis. The deferral is that by pressing the button to quantitative easing, QE, to increase the money supply, for example, Japan just recently doubled its money supply just at one stroke. And the continued policies of the Bank of England, of the European Central Bank, of the Fed in America to increase the money supply and keep long-term interest rates extremely low. This is not actually any dramatic reform or decisive solution to this crisis, even in the economic dimension. But rather it's a deferral. It is a kind of political cycle short-termism. It's overseen by technocrats, but it's still a deferral. It's not a solution. And by displacing and deferring, my thesis is the crisis deepens. It is not fundamentally resolved at all. It's in a kind of suspended animation, but only on the surface of things. Things might seem to be somewhat returning to a normalcy, but actually even that is a dangerous idea, because it's the so-called normalcy which was actually extremely aberrant in many ways, which brought about the crisis. So that's around a strange situation, but the main thesis is that far from the crisis being over, and the multiple crises which are interacting, the whole is actually deepening, which is very, very much concern to anyone who thinks about the future state of world development and humanity. The other part I want to talk about is just the idea that we're in a long-term period of the relative decline of the West, and that is a part and parcel of the rise of the global South, the global center shift to what we call the global South. Where they arise and give new leadership, new dynamism. There's a new discussion about state capitalism. There's a new dynamism arising from the global South. And the thesis that I would put forward, that in the next 20 years, this ascent of the global South and the new realignments of South-South relations and South-North relations will restructure the world economy in very significant, if not profound, ways, which will make the system very, very different 20 years from now than it is now, and is something, therefore, the long-term studies should be looking at. And many scholars are, of course, working on it now, very much so, working on this rise of the global South, where you've got, on the one hand, you've got a new commitment after the Millennium Development Goals to eradicate poverty around the world, and at the same time, you have hundreds of millions of new consumers and middle-class social forces around the global South who also play a new role in the reshaping of the world. And the long-term effects on world order and on global governance are difficult to predict. But we all know that, for example, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are meeting in a serious way, have launched their own bank with a $100 billion initial capital investment as a kind of, in a way, counter-hegemonic project to the World Bank and the IMF. You could go on to enumerate a whole variety of realignments in a way that shows that the ascent of the South is a profound long-term structural change in the world economy as we've known it, and that's part and parcel of the relative decline of the West. It doesn't mean the absolute decline of the West, but the whole nature of world order and global governance is definitely in a transitional period. At the present time, one of the most acute arenas of the politics of this global crisis is obviously in Europe and areas near to Europe, such as the whole of the Mediterranean, where we've seen the overthrow of a whole number of regimes and a continued social conflict, some polarization, the war in Syria. And across southern Europe, you find a whole number of countries that are still in a period of prolonged contraction, where they are still teetering with problems of sovereign debt crisis, and that's related to the banking crisis within those countries themselves and Europe as a whole. The two have, in a sense, fused. The banking crisis and the sovereign debt crisis now interact with each other, and it's a very fragile situation. Everyone knows that the Troika, with the IMF recruited in, as it were, as part of the disciplining factor to set the books right in Europe, is also, though, however, having in the short term, at least in the medium term, very depressing types of effects. And you've seen the possibility that Europe enters into a prolonged period of stagnation, as I mentioned before, relative decline of the West, as a long-term situation, a long-term process. One of the questions that's begged about this is the role of Germany, or let's say the hegemonic question. Whether, I mean, according to some classical theory, the hegemon needs to be able to be willing to commit long-term, continuous, and very substantial resources, let's say funds, for example, as well as other institutional types of roles and policies, in order to sustain the welfare and prosperity of the entire system and maintain its rules for the benefit of all. Right now, I think Germany has to decide, and the German people have to decide, whether they're going to take up what some theorists would regard as the correct and appropriate hegemonic role within Europe, or they're going to decline on it. Past iterations in history, such as with the Great Depression, some people have characterized one of the key reasons for the Great Depression and its severity was that there was no real hegemon in the system, and that the candidate, the United States, had in effect declined to accept the role, and it had very negative consequences systemically. But that's one theory. But I mean, I think we're in a kind of situation in Europe where that is a very important question. And if you impose policies that are obviously, according to what we see in the real world, failing to redress the fundamental economic problems, and at the same time causing backlashes, alienation, political mobilization, protest, and divergence, very serious economic divergence between the southern countries in Europe and the northern, or the deficit countries and the surplus countries. And that cannot, be sustained. And so one hypothesis is that Germany, in conjunction with several other quite wealthy northern countries, will if they accept the hegemonic role, will have to commit themselves to very, very substantial, long-term structural transfer of funds and support to the rest of Europe, and actually accept policies that will resolve the crisis fundamentally to create prosperity and recovery for all the people. The divergence and dichotomization and social conflict in Europe is not a sustainable approach. So Europe's crisis is certainly deepening. On the previous discussion about deepening, it's at a very crucial turning point, where we know that QE and quantitative easing is not a permanent policy. It cannot go on indefinitely, and perhaps it cannot really go on all that much longer. I mean, obviously, there's a sort of elite core of decision makers, very small group, a handful of people who are really in a position to determine these policies or even to dictate them. But that's part of the dynamics of this crisis, not only in Europe, but everywhere, is that at the same time that you have the imposition of re-commodification, the extension of marketization, in a way, not the death of what was called neoliberal economic globalization, but its acceleration in many ways, or intensification. You also, therefore, have conscientization of a large number of people who are adversely affected by these policies, this situation. You have their mobilization. They become part of a new protest movement. That's one side of what's happening. But there's also the opening up of possibilities, therefore, where the old paradigms are fundamentally challenged by large numbers of people, because those paradigms don't provide an accurate and useful solution for them, for their daily lives and their concerns and what's really happening to them and their families. So, in other words, that opens up a whole range of possibilities where people try many, many other alternatives. They entertain new ideas. The debate intellectually is about which policy ideas, which types of organizational innovations, which alternatives will be the most viable in whatever arena. Those are all also happening, and they're happening around the world as well, in the global south. In many places in the global south, there's a similar kind of dynamic going on. And you find that people themselves are making history. It's one of the aspects about globalization that's most important and most central, and including in the work of our journal, is to always focus on social change in the broadest sense. and the way in which people make that social change themselves as part of the process. They are not separate to the process. They're not simply passively receiving something that's structurally determined and that is therefore inevitable, but that in these many multi-dimensional ways, people make their own history. And that's very much part of this crisis. In fact, it's central to this crisis, and it's central to the outcomes of this crisis. Well, the journal has, from its outset, been not only multidisciplinary in a very serious way, to be open to really any field that is doing some relevant research into many different kinds of processes and with many different types of concepts and theoretical frameworks. The journal remains committed to that, absolutely. But at the same time, it's been an engaged journal, which has tried to stay abreast of what we regard as important types of arenas of change, of movements, of conflicts, issue areas, problem areas, as well as conceptual and theoretical debates about how to understand globalization as a general concept and all of its many differentiated processes, or the ways in which it can be conceptualized. From the start, it was a pluralization of the whole concept of globalization and a rejection of the fact that there could ever be one single totalizing concept or theory of globalization. We remain completely committed to that. And at the same time, so we have plans and many articles and special issues over the next 2 and 3 years, which therefore try continually to keep abreast of what's happening. So, I mean, we continue to have special issues that look at a variety of movements and how to conceptualize and theorize movements and their mobilizations, their forms, their strategies, what kinds of alternatives, and how to understand these subjectivities, including of labor, of peasant movements, many kinds of movements all around the world, of resistance, and even of revolution. As we had a special issue on the Arab revolutions, we've had special issues on the poor and social movements in Latin America, dedicated special movements about global movements as a category. We have more of those coming. Several different projects around those themes, and the specific issue areas like the Millennium Development Goals and what comes after the Millennium Development Goals. We'll have special issues on those topics, on historical dialectics and dialectics, how to understand the whole dynamic of social change, on time and globalization, temporal aspects in many different ways. You can conceptualize temporal processes in globalization. So we have a whole, the journal is open to scholars who want to come in and address some key issue or theme of the dynamics of global change and the future of world order. The rise of the global south is another key concern, and the many different ways in which you can see new forms arising from the global south and the changes it's bringing about within the south and in the whole global system. The journal wants to keep remaining not simply an academic enterprise, but I think it's a place for activist scholars who feel that their work is very closely engaged with the social processes of the world, and that our role is to try to understand those, analyze them, offer some understanding of them, and so I think that really defines the journal, and we're not going to change that fundamental approach.